committees, teams, task forces, review panels, it's obvious to us that groups are an established fact of organizational life. Some people report in management that they're spending up to 80% of their time dealing with committee and group work. From all of this group work, is there any indication that the decisions that come out of committees are better in any way than decisions that would be made by an individual? Are there times when individuals would clearly be better than groups in making decisions? Are there times when group decisions can become catastrophic decisions, really bad decisions? How can we improve decision making in groups since we have to live with it? All things we're going to consider today. Advantages to using groups, sometimes and in some situations. What are these? Let's take a look at the monitor. Some of the advantages that accrue from using groups, if we go to the monitor. Okay, computer, are pooled knowledge and information of the individuals. But the pooled knowledge and information only works to the extent that there are complementary skills and abilities and knowledge of individuals, that it's heterogeneous. If everybody has the same knowledge, the same skills, then you're not accruing anything more by adding individuals into the group. So yeah, groups could generate more ideas, but only if we have some heterogeneity in there and people bring different experience and different skills to the table. Same thing goes in terms of evaluating ideas, that groups can do better with this, okay, but only, again, if it's a mix of a group and the pool judgment somehow is able to offset the dominance of one individual, the intensity of one individual. Okay, if we can come back up to the monitor again and take a look at some of those other advantages. Scanning the environment. Groups are particularly good at this sort of thing, and they scan environments as a whole more than individuals, something that's especially important at the problem identification and information stage. You've got to pull in more ideas, more contact, more things that are going on out there. Bring information into the group rather than working just within the group. The other two aspects that work really well in terms of advantages are decision acceptance and commitment. This because people want to be involved in decisions that affect them. People understand decisions better if they're involved in them. And people generally are more committed to decisions into which they're putting a great deal of time and effort. So another aspect, decision acceptance and commitment. Third aspect is an interesting aspect. Diffusion of responsibility. And maybe one of the important reasons for doing things in groups. Just like forming a corporation, the individual is no longer responsible for the liabilities of the corporation. So too in a group, the individual is no longer directly responsible for bad decisions of the group. You can spread the bad decision, the effect of a bad decision, over a lot of people. So the risk isn't quite as great for taking chances when it's a group decision than when it's an individual decision and you can point at one person. Of course, in a court of law, this may not get you off the hook if you're the president or the CEO of an organization. But psychologically, in terms of making the decision, this notion of diffusion of responsibility particularly for the negative consequences of the decision, seems to be one of the values of it. So yes, there can be advantages, but there are also disadvantages for all of this. What kinds of disadvantages accrue in terms of doing this? Time to reach a decision. Groups are slower. Groups are less efficient than individuals working alone. Why? Process loss. Things that we've talked about previously. The time to get people in to make the decision. The time to get ideas free-flowing. Time. It just takes time to get a number of ideas out there, and sometimes time to fight to get your idea heard. Part of the process loss that you might realize in something like this is you get tired of trying to fight to get your idea in. Nobody's calling on you, so after a while, you withdraw. What's the point? No one's ever going to hear me in this situation. This is particularly true as groups get larger and larger. Conflict is yet another possibility that occurs in terms of disadvantage in making a decision, particularly if you're under the gun and you need to make a quick decision and you know somebody's going to disagree with what you're saying out there. Well, one of the reasons for bringing a group together is to get some controversy out there and to discuss ideas. But sometimes the groups that are in place don't really want this. What they really want is an affirmation or a ratification of what the decision is already. And so putting it out in front of the group for discussion means that you have to at least listen to some of the conflict that can happen out there. People will raise alternative ideas. But sometimes, and that's good, but sometimes the ideas that are raised, the conflict that occurs, is due to protection of turf. So this is what you want to do, but what's in it for me? And if there's nothing in it for me, I'm not buying. Or a different set of priorities. And so you get conflict and standoff. I think one of the best and most dramatic examples of conflict and standoff happened about 3 years ago between a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. The end result was no budget. There was a budget proposed by the president. There was a budget that Congress wanted passed. And what we normally expect in Washington when politics works right is discussion and compromise. Compromise is really the great art of politics. It's doing what's possible. But in this case, there was a standoff on both sides. There was not compromise. And so nothing happened. Each group thinking that, in fact, its agenda was the correct agenda, and there was no give. And so in this case, it was conflict, and conflict driven by ideology in this case, which can sometimes make it very difficult to get groups together and to compromise. If one person could go in there and decide that's it, then there's no conflict. That's why we have mediators, somebody who will go in and decide what's to be done in this situation, a way of bringing groups together and getting a decision where nothing is happening. And finally, domination. Another major problem in group decision making. The minute somebody is appointed leader, you run the risk of that person dominating the session. The nature of group processes and group dynamics is someone is appointed leader. Other people then in the group begin to feel, well, the responsibility really falls on the leader and it's less on my shoulders. So there is immediately less participation. But the leader also begins to believe that the role, without training, and we'll see why group training is important later, is, well, my role is to make the decision in this case. My role is to dominate the conversation. My role is, as leader, to get something out of this, by hook or by crook. And so you have possible domination of a leader, again working with an untrained leader, or the flip side of that is the untrained leader who's rather laissez-faire and passive and sort of lets the group wander, and then one person in the group becomes dominant and the rest of the group becomes passive. Why bother? It doesn't matter. Let's move to adjourn. Get out of here. Whatever you want. It's okay. Let's get out of here. And in that case, the dominant person again has moved an idea forward without there ever really being good discussion of it. And we've lost the advantage of pooled knowledge and pooled evaluation that you hope to get out of a group. So, some clear disadvantages. Situations in which we should use groups. Let's take a look at what these look like. Depends on whether the problem is simple or complex, not straightforward. Let's go with a complex problem first. Clearly, if these two conditions are met, groups will work better than individuals if members have complementary skills, and if there is a free flow of ideas among individuals in the group, and if these ideas are accepted, the group is willing to entertain, the group is open-minded. People don't come in there saying it's my way or no way, which sometimes happens in groups. People come to the table with that perspective. Then groups work better. Then you have the ideal situation. Why complex problems in groups? Again, pooled resources of knowledge, additional scanning of the environment, and additional evaluation of the various ideas. So complex problems, groups, if we have the situation working well. What about simple problems? How do those work? Well, a bit differently. First of all, with a simple problem, if there's nobody in the group that particularly has the information to solve it, then the group as a whole will work worse than the very worst member of a group. In that case, you might as well use an individual. The blind leading the blind gets you nowhere. And so one individual coming up with something will probably do better in this. If it's a simple problem and somebody in the group has the information and everybody's willing to accept the decision, you're still better off going with an individual because you don't engage in all of the possibilities of process loss just from coordination of time. Why get a group together for some simple question? What's the point? Just make the decision, as long as everybody's willing to accept it, and get on with it. The only time you'd want to call a group together for a simple issue is if you're very certain that nobody's going to accept the decision unless you call the group together. You know, Entenmann's or Dunkin' Donuts. Simple decision, but if people feel they have a stake in this, then you might as well vote on it. And sometimes you can do just as well having people vote on it and not really getting them together. Because in this society, one of the group rules that we've established, one of the group norms in decision making is majority rules. We've pretty much accepted that. People go along with that notion. So sometimes you want to use individuals. There is yet one additional situation in which individuals, interestingly, do better than groups of people. And this is in the area of where creativity is needed, where you need to do brainstorming on a very creative issue. A lot of hearsay out there, a lot of intuitive informal knowledge tells you, oh, you need to get a group together to brainstorm on creative problems. That's the best way to handle it. In fact, the research tells us differently. The research says that if you have 5 creative people in a room, each of them working individually on the problem, you're going to generate more possibilities, more alternatives than if you put those 5 people in a group and have them work. Why? What's likely to happen that somehow restricts the productivity, particularly when it gets to creativity? Well, inhibition. People get inhibited. And in groups, whereas individually working on something like this, they're quite willing to write down a solution that may seem off the wall because it's just a list that's going out there. Within a group, they withhold and restrain themselves. It's the nature of the group process, things that we talked about before. And we'll get into this even further as we deal with a real problem called groupthink. I'm holding groupthink for just a few minutes. Some processes in group decision making. 2 things before we get into this very thorny issue called groupthink. One of them has to do with risk, and the other one has to do with something that not discussed too frequently, decision valence. Do groups make riskier decisions than individuals? Well, what I said before certainly suggests it because you can diffuse responsibility. Or do groups make more conservative decisions because of the checks and balances, that pooled evaluation that can rein in that one wild individual in the group who wants to do something that seems to be off the curve? What happens? Well, the answer is both happen. That groups that have a tendency towards risk-taking when getting together move even more towards risk-taking. Where do we see this happening? Oh, well, we saw it happening in the Far East, in the Asian banking situation. The market, which collapsed just a week ago, had a lot to do with the fact that loans were made in banks on very shaky customers. It looked as if there was a chance to make a lot of money. But in fact, when they looked at, if you look very carefully as to whether this person could pay or the group could pay back, really shaky. And banks were taking wild chances because as groups of individuals okaying these loans, they thought they could make a lot of money. They were getting riskier. Same thing happened in the US in the 80s with the Savings and Loan Administration, which ultimately had to have a huge government bailout. But the bank loan departments there, the savings and loan committees, were making loans to friends and loans to individuals that normally, in a more conservative time, more conservative group, those loans would have never been made. So the move towards risk, it failed. We all paid for it. But the group certainly got riskier. But you get conservative shifts going on as well, where groups that tend to be conservative, as they start talking about the situation, start to reinforce each other as to why they should be conservative, and they kind of begin to one-up each other on conservation. Same process happens in risk. So the tendency in group decision-making, we say, is to move towards polarization. Whatever is the initial propensity of the group, it moves out further towards the extremes. That's why the need to have heterogeneous groups to help bring in different perspectives. So one of the aspects of the process in group decision-making. The second thing that I want to talk about is called decision valence. How do we know what decision is going to be the one that's going to fly in a group? A couple of researchers, Richard Hoffman, and primarily, and his mentor, Norman Maier, did work in an area called decision valence. Valence is the same concept that we were dealing with before when we talked about expectancy theory. In this case, it's positives over negatives in terms of the comments that are made about a decision. So you have groups sitting around a table and they're talking pros and cons. By the time you subtract the cons from the pros about any one alternative solution or any one person that you're considering hiring, you have what's called decision valence. And you literally can do counts on this in groups if you tape the conversation that's going on and you score it for positive comments and negative comments. Hoffman holds, let's check this out, that the threshold for acceptance of a decision, whether it's going to fly or not, is about 15. 15 positives over negatives. And the first decision that reaches 15 is probably going to be the one that's going to fly. Now remember, it can change, so it's got to hit 15 and stay at a steady 15 throughout. So other alternatives will be entertained, but in a good number of the groups that he looked at, it's that first one, like first impressions. A lot of things that we're talking about come back into play. The initial decision that groups arrive at is the one that probably is going to be the one that will hold out in the end. And we'll talk about this. Is also a problem in group decision making. What it means is that often good alternatives are out there and they get dropped out of the sequence because they're getting insufficient attention. Now, how does one alternative, one candidate, reach that threshold? Two possibilities. There is somebody who is a staunch backer of that idea within the committee and speaks to it endlessly. Somebody raises a negative and this person always comes back with the positives and stays with it. And some people wear down. Or you can have a number of people who are backing an idea. It's spread out among a group of individuals. So it can either be a group of individuals or one really firm backer who just won't let it die, that tenacious, and stays with it until the rest of the group gets worn down and gives in. And that's the one that flies. So we can look at this. Next time you're in a group and you want to be the group watcher instead of the group participant, step back and count valences and see what happens and see what decision works. But group decision making isn't always the best. And sometimes catastrophe does happen because the situation is set for bad decisions and poor decision processes. We call this groupthink. Groupthink is the tendency of highly cohesive groups to conform to group pressures. One, there is conformity, and two, to suspend reality testing. Is this really going to work? And three, to engage in consensus seeking. So there is conformity, suspension of reality testing, good judgment, and there is engagement in consensus seeking, a lot of pressure for consensus. How does this happen? Well, we're going to look at the antecedents that set the conditions of it, the symptoms of it so we can recognize it when we see it, and take a look at the outcomes. How does this happen? Antecedents. If we can go back up to the, good. The groups are highly cohesive to begin with. Those members are really bonded to each other. They are really attracted to the group. The group structure is one in which the members are homogeneous. There's a great deal of similarity that they see among each other. They all graduated from the same school. They're all involved in similar careers. Whatever it is, there is a homogeneity of thinking that prevails. It doesn't have to be a homogeneity demographically, in terms of gender, or in terms of race. It is homogeneity of thinking that dominates in this group. There is isolation of the group. This group travels on its own. They not only work together, they're probably socializing together. And finally, there's usually strong leadership in the group. And if the situation is particularly stressful, we have even more the backdrop, the foundations for group think. And the two decisions that we will track through this and look at it are two decisions that have been discussed extensively, both government situations. One, the fiasco of the decision to invade the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy administration. And the second, the Watergate debacle during the Nixon administration. Okay, these are both good because they have been so publicly discussed and they fit the pattern of exactly what we're talking about. Symptoms of this. Okay, if we go again to the overhead. The group overestimates itself over a number of issues. First of all, the members have an exaggerated belief of the morality of the issue. They believe that what they are doing is really the correct thing. The group tends to overestimate its own resources as being infallible. We're the best and we're the brightest. Can't possibly make a mistake because we're all out of Harvard, or we've all been through the crucible and we've been tested. We know what we're talking about. And finally, there is an air of invulnerability. Nothing's going to happen to us. Infallibility, invulnerability. Nothing can touch us. We're too smart to get caught. If that's the case, and sometimes that is the case. And that's why the cover-ups happen. So when we have this overestimation, we see one of the symptoms going on. It's a smugness that sets in about the group. The second is close-mindedness. What does this mean? It means that the group is not listening to anybody else outside, and in terms of the correctness of their own actions, rationalizing. There's lots of outside information that's pouring in. What's happening to scanning the environment? Shut down, gone, not happening anymore. And rationalization of their own actions. Well, if you no longer have scanning the environment and yet there's information going on out there, it's not that these people are deaf and it's not that they're shutting off the TVs and not reading newspapers, but they're looking at this information and saying, what do these people know? We're on the inside. They don't know what's really happening. They can't possibly know what's happening. We've got all the inside information. We know better than everybody else. Rationalization. Diminishing of the importance of external information. The second thing is they begin to stereotype people who are on the outside. Stereotyping means, again, we're better. The people out there are not as good, not as moral, not as knowledgeable. And they begin to believe stereotypes that they have of individuals. And so, again, They're not listening to other people. And then the increased pressure for uniformity, the push for consensus, the pressure to sustain cohesiveness. And in terms of doing this, members start to censor their own thoughts, self-censorship. I have a reservation. Something's eating away at me that this isn't the right thing to do. This isn't the way to go. I see some possible negative consequences. But I seem to be alone in this. Nobody else is voicing it. I know these people. I know if they're really bright, they would say something. I must be the wrong one. Get rid of those thoughts. Don't think about them. They're wrong thoughts to think. Self-censorship. And so one of the things that happen. And some people begin to act as mind guards in the group. They don't let negative information in. Let's schedule meetings when the one person who might have something negative to say is out of town. Don't listen to that individual. Don't pay attention to this column that was written in the newspaper. That person is out to get us. That person has a personal vendetta. Forget that. Don't even look at it. So self-appointed mind guards to not let information get in. Those who do not agree, those who do not conform, are increasingly left out of the group. There's no place for them in the group. They're not called into meetings. Their telephone doesn't ring anymore. And the decision is going to get made without these individuals, because these individuals are now grit in the gears of the decision making. They bring in negative information to the group, and if they had been in the group, well, we can't deny their stature or their fitting into the group. And so we somehow push them out of the group, and they're no longer in the loop. They're now out of the loop in decision making. Nobody wants to hear what they have to say. Well, what this means then is that there is an illusion of unanimity. There isn't real unanimity. There isn't real unanimity because people who would have disagreed have been left out of the loop, and individuals who have reservations are sitting on them. But there is the illusion, oh, we're unanimous on this course of action. Not good. So what happens now with all of this? What does it ultimately result in? Defective decision making. Defective in what way? Incomplete survey of alternatives. The number of possible alternatives are being limited because people have censored themselves and because we've eliminated people from the group. Incomplete survey of objectives. What are we supposed to be accomplishing in this? Again, it's been narrowed. There is a failure to think about the risks of the preferred choice. Not considering that. Self-censorship. If the risks were to come out, if you played this thing out fully, probably you wouldn't engage in that course of action. But those risks are minimized. It's not going to happen. Can't possibly happen. We're invulnerable and we're infallible. How can any of these things happen? Poor information search in general. Poor evaluation. Real bias in processing the information at hand. Not getting full and complete and objective processing. Not only failure to work out Plan B, there is no Plan B. Why? Because no way Plan A is going to fail. So nothing alternative. What are we going to do when the loan goes bad? What are we going to do when all the loans go bad? Who are we going to fall back on? The bank closes. No one had worked out those alternatives in the process. One of the bad decisions that was made, another case history, is the Ford that exploded. Pinto. I was waiting for that. Thank you. And this was a calculated decision that to re-engineer it would add more to the price than the company was willing to engage in and assume at that point. And the decision was made, so what? We're a corporation. We can sustain anything, and individuals are not held responsible for deaths anyway. Bad decision, wrong. All the information came out. Those tanks did in fact explode. People did die. There were huge lawsuits and huge awards made to individuals, and ultimately a change in the law where people, members of corporations, could be held liable for people's deaths. Bad decision. But people were only talking to each other. The sense of being infallible and invulnerable got in the way. Okay, so finally, yes, bad decisions are the other thing that happens here. There is a high probability of a bad decision. I said we're going to look at two decisions in all of this. First was the fiasco at Bay of Pigs, which has been chronicled in a book by Halberstam called The Best and the Brightest. It happened in the Kennedy administration with a decision to invade Cuba. Okay, it never really happened. It started to happen. We look very foolish in all of this. Pulled back, had to apologize. It was terrible. How did such a group of people, all out of Harvard and other illustrious institutions, arrive at something like this? And the answer is groupthink. It was a group that talked only to each other, began to think of itself as invulnerable and infallible, and there was a lot of censoring going on. Same thing happened if we take a look at Watergate that happened during the Nixon administration. Why not fess up to this silly little breaking into an office, say that it wasn't authorized, but yes, it did happen, and move on with it? The problem with Watergate was not the Watergate break-in itself. That could have been handled if it had been owned up to and somehow said that it was never authorized from above and somebody got carried away and we'll fire these people. It was the cover-up that did the administration in. The notion that somehow they could never be reached. But they were reached. There were ultimately cracks in the administration. The famous Watergate tapes. There was enough questioning ultimately so that people admitted to this. There was a press that dogged all of this and stayed with it and wrote about it extensively. And it fell apart. Bad decision. Decision made by people who talked only to each other, who thought that they were infallible. There was a sense of morality, that what they were doing was right. They were working for a cause that was for the country, and they knew better than everyone else. Fell apart. So we can see from these two public decisions, but decisions like this happen within organizations as well. The historian Barbara Tuchman has written a wonderful book called The March of Folly, where she looks at generals who have made terrible decisions about wars and terrible consequences that followed by not playing out all the consequences and looking at Plan B. Could this really happen? So history is filled with examples of groupthink and bad decisions that were made because alternatives were not considered and people spoke only to each other and were not playing out all of the consequences of things. Preventive tactics. Can we somehow get around this? Can we ultimately work towards improving the effectiveness of group decisions? And the answer is yeah. Some preventive tactics. Bring in outside experts to help evaluate what's going on in the group. And certainly work at minimizing isolation. Don't be afraid of controversy within the group. Listen to it. It may ultimately be valuable to you. Pay attention to it. Train leaders, train leaders, train leaders. Train leaders to draw out members of the group. Don't have them work towards encouraging self-censorship, but exactly the reverse of that. And finally, within groups, establish a norm of critical review. And we'll look at ways at how these can be done. But before you go ahead, make sure that to the best of all possible situations, you've played out the various plans and looked at the pluses and the minuses of it. So we have then a whole bunch of techniques that we can use to help improve the effectiveness of group decisions. Group training, brainstorming to a certain extent, the Delphi technique, the nominal group technique, managing controversy, electronic groups, and my own word of caution at the end. Group training. What can we hope to gain out of training group leaders? If we go to the overhead, okay. That the leader will learn to state the problem in an objective way. Not so it's slanting the discussion in one way, but stating it without bias. The second thing would be to provide relevant information where there is relevant information to the group, and to share the relevant information. If information comes in and you have part of it, give it to everybody in the group so that everybody's working off the same information base. Don't withhold it so that some people know more than others, because you're not going to get a good decision, and that can happen. You're going to choose a candidate. Somebody knows more about a candidate than other people and shares it with a few, but not with everybody. You've got to get that information out so it's pertinent to everybody. Drawing out group members I've already talked about. You've got to be able to go around the group and get people to think about various issues and draw that out. Preventing domination, very important for the leader to prevent domination. Not to dominate himself or herself, and not to let another individual in the group dominate it, because people will get turned off in the group and stop participating. Avoid moving to evaluation prematurely. Get all the ideas out there before you start saying no to some of the ideas. Often what happens kind of naturally in groups is an idea will come up, and before any other ideas come up, it's either the one that's going to be the preferred favorite or it's immediately rejected. And it falls by the wayside, and it could be a good candidate or a good idea. Stimulate discussion as a leader and clarify points. And finally, summarize as you're going along so that the group has a sense of progress. Here's where we are and here's where we have to go. The other thing that group leaders can do in terms of training is to reduce 3 problems that tend to occur. One is unconflicted adherence. In this case, again, it's as if self-censorship was coming in. The group automatically says, this is the first idea. This is what we're going to go for, immediately. The second thing that can happen is defensive avoidance. In this situation, what's happening with defensive avoidance? Well, denial. There is no problem out there. I don't even want to think about the problems that are out there. Or the information regarding problems is not considered in any way. So with defensive avoidance, there is sometimes procrastination. If I don't think about it, it'll go away, and I won't have to deal with it. Or, let's use yesterday's solution. I don't have time to work on a new solution, so I'm just going to do what we did last year. That worked. Well, situations have changed. It may not work. Or a sense of avoiding responsibility for this. Nobody cares, it's not my problem. Again, defensive avoidance in terms of tackling the problem. Or hypervigilance. Hypervigilance means in a stressful situation particularly, you're flipping from solution to solution. You can't even settle on anything. There's no weighing of any of the decisions. It's as if you're spinning your wheels with hypervigilance. We could try this, we could try this, we could try this. And in the end, whatever it is you try is going to be the wrong thing. So group training can help minimize these three issues. Unconflicted adherence, this is the first solution, that's what we're going to go with. We don't have time to do anything else. Defensive avoidance happens all the time. Okay? If I don't think about it, it'll go away. And hypervigilance. Another thing that can be done is brainstorming. We talked about this a bit before. Brainstorming is an attempt to increase creative solutions by getting a group of people together. And the notion is here that they'll sort of play off each other, that one person's suggestion will be a stimulus for somebody else. Let's sit down and kick this around and see what we can come up with. The problem is that more frequently inhibition sets in. The problem is that we don't usually in a group suspend all evaluation, that members coming into a group don't suspend all evaluation of ideas. And the off-the-wall ideas that might really work, that might be what you're looking for, are the ones that are censored the most in brainstorming. The other problem in brainstorming is inability to get an idea heard. You've got an idea. May sound crazy, but you're willing to push it. But you've got domination going in the group. You've got a small group of individuals that are just talking among themselves. And you keep raising your hand, and you want to get noticed, and you want to get noticed. And finally, that's it. I'm tired of trying to get noticed in this group. Forget it, and the idea doesn't happen. So because of reasons of all these things that we've talked about in terms of process loss happening in brainstorming, rarely does it work the way it's supposed to, and yet often a lot of time gets wasted in brainstorming. Is there anything we could do to make brainstorming work better? And the answer is yep. Two techniques. One is the Delphi technique. In the Delphi technique, you're using experts as a way of trying to get solutions to a problem, and you're setting up not real groups in this instance, but something like a nominal group. You solicit from the experts their solutions. The solutions are then compiled and circulated to experts. And at this point, experts comment upon the various different solutions. They then try to reach consensus about one of the solutions. If they reach consensus, that's what's adopted. If they don't reach consensus, it cycles through again, and they discuss all of the solutions again, and again try to reach consensus. So here we have experts, and the reason we have more solutions to begin with is that they've worked individually to begin with. There is no possibility for domination at the beginning or for inhibition. So one of the techniques that's been used, we're going to talk about electronic groups in a minute. It's been modeled using electronic groups as well, and working with experts. And there are instances where, yes, in this sort of situation, you achieve good quality decisions. You achieve the better decision than if individuals had worked alone. But we're coming back to where we were at the beginning and setting up the circumstances for the solution working. You're building into it the ideal situation. The second is a nominal group technique. And here, the group gathers to hear the problem. But then, instead of discussing the problem, they write down answers privately. The ideas are then all tallied and presented on a chart. And each idea is discussed by the group members. No ideas get lost out of this list. No self-censorship, no problem getting your point across. Everything gets on the list. Then you go back, members privately rank the ideas. Remember, in this society, majority rules. The solution with the highest rank wins. What have we done in these two instances? Well, if we cycle through, I'm going to back way up to this one. Groups exceed individuals. We've built into it the situation where members have complementary skills, particularly in the Delphi, but you can build that into the nominal group as well. And we've forced the situation where ideas are freely communicated because everything is put down on a list and it's circulated to everybody. And we've set the rules so that majority rules, the ideas have to be accepted, if it's whatever the majority is, or consensus, same thing. We've achieved consensus on this, but we're setting the stage in both situations for all of the ideas coming up and all of the ideas being heard and being evaluated. That's why these two techniques have some advantage in group decision making, although it seems like a forced way of running a group. You certainly don't use these groups when you're under a time constraint. It's simply going to take you too long. But you use these groups when you know there's an issue out there and you're calling some kind of task force together to work on the issue and try to solve whatever it is. At the beginning of the Clinton administration, there was this huge task force pulled together to deal with the national health problems. There was a leader. And presumably it was a good cross-section. They ultimately came out with a report which I understand was something like this. It was huge. Ultimately, it was a flawed report. It was a flawed plan. But in all of this, a lot of money was used, a lot of money in bringing groups together face-to-face and having hearings. If they'd gotten a few experts together in this kind of situation where there was no deadline in terms of meeting a solution needed, nothing was out there except, to get it done during the first term. So there was a lot of time to work. One of these techniques might have been an equally good type of technique in terms of getting something out. Possibility. Delphi technique or the nominal group technique. Now, we move along and we come back to the different, back up one. Okay. Two more things to take a look at in all of this. Managing controversy. I mentioned before that controversy can be helpful as long as it's to the issue and not to somebody's personal agenda in all of this. How do we do this? Well, the devil's advocate. The person whose role it is in the group to come up with the negative ideas. The contrarian of the group. Give us your negative opinions. Show us where our thinking is flawed. Show us all the possible negative consequences that can emanate from this. And you install that as a role within the group. That's what that person, or maybe even better, two people, have to say, so that in looking at courses of action, you understand where the plan may fail. You understand why you might need Plan B as a backup. The last of these is electronic groups. Do they add anything beyond the face-to-face groups? Well, given that workers today, employees, are often far flung from each other, and management is remote also, sometimes that's the only way we're going to get people together, so that we can expect a lot of electronic groups to continue to grow. But electronic groups are more or less like nominal groups. Nominal groups meeting apart from each other, listing their ideas, and hopefully trying to reach consensus. Research has been done on electronic groups as well as face-to-face groups in terms of production of ideas and decision quality and time to reach consensus. Here's what we do know about electronic groups. Much better in terms of production of ideas and evaluation of ideas. Why? The inhibition that exists in a face-to-face situation is no longer there when you're sitting at your own computer and you're tossing ideas out. All ideas do get heard in electronic groups. You don't have the problem of somebody not calling on you. You type it in and it goes into the system. So everything gets in there. The problem with electronic groups is if you have to reach consensus electronically, you better set up some norm and do some voting, because chances are you're not going to reach consensus, at least not within any kind of usable time frame, because people are wedded to their own ideas, and in the privacy of their own offices, at their own computers, without the group pressures on you, somebody staring you in the eye, without the pressure to get out of there and go on to some other meeting or go on to some other thing, it's much easier to stick to your guns. Very often people wear down at meetings just because enough time already. I have to get on with life. I can't stay here forever and toss this around. And so you settle for something that you're not so happy with. But the time pressures force it. You don't have those time pressures on electronic groups. So something else needs to take its place, possibly a voting or a ranking procedure that you will agree will be the course of action in terms of reaching consensus. My own caveat in all of this, my own experience and my observations of other people's experiences. Don't make a decision under extreme pressure. Buy time, and buy time. What happens when you try to make a decision under extreme pressure? You don't think of all of the alternatives that would be easy for you to think of under other situations. And you don't engage in good evaluation. And you don't seek out resources that could help you. It seems to me that there are very few decisions in life that are so earth-shaking that you can't buy at least a day's time. 24 hours might do it for you. But when the person in the showroom says, you have to make up your mind now or else the deal is off the table, then take the deal off the table. So, whoops, we're out. Okay, where were we? Okay, we've considered decision-making group versus individual, the positives, the negatives. Next time, we look at power in the organization and political activities. Used wisely, used foolishly, what happens?